Good morning. The time is now 9:30 and it's time for me to resume this hearing. Now, firstly, I'd just like to check the technology that everybody can hear and see appropriately. So today, I believe, attending this session for the council, we have Mr. Jameson, the council solicitor.
Thank you, Ma'am. Present and hopefully correct.
Thank you. We also have Nicola Shave.
Thank you, Mum.
Can I just ask, is it Miss or Mrs. Shave?
It's Miss.
Right, thank you very much. I believe we also have Mr. Terry Begley.
Thank you, Ma'am. Yes.
Good, excellent. And joining us, we have Sam Silcox from Harris Lamb.
Morning, Ma'am.
Morning. And we have Stephen Lucas from Lucas Land and Planning.
That's correct, Ma'am. Yeah.
Well, I think that's everybody. Lovely, thank you very much. So my name is Helen Hockenhull and I am a Chartered Town Planner and I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold this examination into the legal compliance and soundness of the Corby Part 2 Local Plan 2011 to 2031. Just as by way of introduction for the people joining us on this session, I just want to say a little bit about the organisation of this virtual hearing, including some procedural matters and timetabling. The hearings will take the form of a structured discussion, which based on the matters, issues and questions that I have already been prepared and put on the council's website. I will lead the hearing and ask the questions and invite people one at a time to contribute to the discussion. Responses should be directed to me. Usually I will start with the council and ask them to explain the reasons why they have approached a policy in a particular way. You should not attempt to speak unless invited to do so. If you wish to speak on a particular matter, please use the hand facility on the toolbar to notify me, and I will then invite you into the discussion at an appropriate time. The first time you speak, it will be helpful if you could please state your name and, if applicable, whom you are representing. So during the event, unless you are speaking, it's very helpful if everyone could please keep their microphone muted to minimise any unwanted background noise. It would also be helpful to turn cameras off unless you're actually speaking on a particular matter, just to assist with bandwidth with our reception this morning. If you become disconnected from this event for some reason, or on a future event, and you find you can't connect, please contact the programme officer immediately and he will do his best to assist you wherever he can and ensure you can join the session. When you finish speaking, please remember to turn your microphone off and lower your hand. So for the benefit of third parties who may be watching this on the YouTube, on the council's website, when you refer to documents, you please refer to them using their full title and examination reference, rather than by some abbreviation or any other acronym. As you know, the hearing will be live streamed via the internet and a copy of the recording will be kept on the council's website. At the end of the hearing, I will end the session and ask all the participants to log out. Please can you also make sure you attend the hearing from start to finish and avoid leaving the screen except during the breaks. This session will continue till around 11 o'clock and then we'll have a break and then we move on to other matters. Right, so are there any questions before we start today's hearing session? No, we're all quiet, that's good, excellent. So in terms of today, matter 3 we are looking at delivering housing. Now what I intend to do is look at this basically in 5 areas, which will basically cover the questions in the MIQs, but possibly look at them in slightly different order. So what I want to start with today is the overall supply to meet the Joint Core Strategy requirement. Then look at the spatial distribution, checking that is in line with the Joint Core Strategy. Move on to the housing trajectory, which will look at whether that is realistic, look at lead-in times, build rates, the reliance on the SUEs, their past performance, and a little bit about the trigger for the partial review if those SUEs don't come forward. I think that covers most of those areas, but we'll also cover a little bit about rural areas within that discussion as well. Then I'd like to look at the strategic opportunity site. And finally, my final question, which is a minor matter really, relating to one particular site which the council wishes now to remove from the list of allocations. So that's how I intend to proceed this morning. Firstly then, to look at what in effect is my question 1 on the MIQs, looking at the overall supply, and does the plan provide sufficient deliverable housing sites to meet the housing requirements of the borough to 2031? So firstly, I'd like to invite the council to start us off on this discussion and to provide a little bit of background on that particular point. So I think it's Miss Shave, I think, that's dealing with this. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Yes. Okay, so over to you. Thank you.
Yes, so we kind of set out in our matter statement the total in our housing trajectory for the plan period. To sort of summarise that, our total housing land supply for the duration of the plan period, which is committed sites, commitments, and that are completed so far, totals 11,324 dwellings. This amount obviously provides 2,124 dwellings above the JCS requirement of 9,200 dwellings over the plan period. This will equate to around 23% surplus for the duration of the plan period, which the council believe will provide a sufficient flexibility to supply an adequate supply of housing to meet that requirement up until 2031.
Right, okay, so just to be clear, that position has been revised from the original submission document, that's right?
Yes, it has. So the one that was in the publication draft before the submission in the revised track changes version, that was based on the previous year's housing land supply statement, which was set out in the 2017-18 AMR. And also it is not in the actual evidence base, but there was a committee report that was which went to the local plan committee on the 5th of December 2018. So the actual submission version is the new latest published housing land supply statement.
Right, okay, so that just to be clear on this then, there's a paragraph 7.8 and table 7 in the submission version of the document, which suggests that a total of 12,044 dwellings expected, which equates to a 30% buffer, if you will, above the joint core strategy requirement of the 9,200 dwellings. So clearly that element of the document will need to be revised through a main modification. So that's paragraph 7.8 and table 7. Will just need to be updated effectively to take account of those new figures. No, that's fine, thank you. That's a fairly factual position. The key thing I think here is whether or not that an element of provision provides sufficient flexibility, and whether or not that provides sufficient buffer in the case of changes with particular sites, particularly the sustainable urban extensions, and whether or not there is a sufficient flexibility in case of delays or other circumstances that mean they don't come forward as quickly as they may well do. So from a factual position, that's adequate for now. We'll come back to the actual flexibility issue shortly. If we just move on to the spatial distribution of actual housing delivery within the borough, and does that accord with the spatial distribution set out in the joint core strategy? So perhaps you could just move on to that particular point, please.
Yes, that's absolutely fine, ma'am. So table 1 of our matter 3 statement, we've produced a table to hopefully help answer this really. It sets out that in the Grove Town, which is where we expect most of our housing to be delivered in accordance with the JCS, 10,108 homes will be delivered within the Grove Town, which equates to around 90.5%. Relating back to the JCS requires around 90.1% to be in the Grove Town. So I think this kind of demonstrates that it is in accordance with the JCS requirement there in relation to the distribution in policy 29. It also sets out in the JCS, we expect around 1.3% in the rural areas. Our housing land supply position in the published submission version, it sets out that we'll provide around 2.2%. So we're oversupplying in the rural areas in the current position. So I believe that we believe as the council, we can demonstrate that we are our housing land supply is in accordance with that JCS requirement and the distribution in accordance to policy 29 as well.
Right, okay, thank you, Ms. Shave. I noticed, Mr. Silcox, you have your hand up. You were to come in at this point?
Yes, please, Ma'am. It was just a couple of points on the first two issues there. One, just with the changes that sort of resulted from the publication plan to the submission plan. I also picked up that there was a change in the buffer, I think, suggested by the council. So it went from 20% in the publication plan as being their sort of target level down to 10% in the submission plan. And we weren't clear as to why that sort of change had occurred. And obviously that could be relevant when we look at the trajectory in a bit more detail as to which buffer might be appropriate. And just on the distribution, it was just picking up on policy 29 in the joint core strategy. I think in the last paragraph there, it talks about the rural area and so on, but it also talks, I think we've got, and in terms of overall numbers, I would agree that it's broadly in line with what the strategy envisaged. But I think the intention of the core strategy was to make sure you sort of had a range of sites coming forward across the plan period as a whole. And I think that they were supposed to be sort of phasing, I think, within the rural area to show how you can maintain that sort of consistency of variation in your supply across the plan period. For a number of reasons, I presume. I mean, I think they're twofold really. One is it provides sort of certainty in terms of delivery, and equally it sort of allows those smaller builders to access the market. I think that's perhaps that particular point isn't necessarily consistent at the moment with the core strategy, because once we get past the first 5 years of the plan, those sites fall away. There is no delivery in the rural area at the moment going beyond those first 5 years, and we do have a sort of perhaps a deficit for any additional housing need that might arise in the rural area in that time period. I think at the moment there's an absence of a policy which picks up on particularly the market housing side of it. We've got a note in the core strategy. There is I think it's policy 13, which deals with traditional rural exception sites and affordable housing. There's nothing to pick up on additional market housing needs that might arise in those locations. And I think that was something the plan would benefit from.
Right, okay, thank you for that. If you don't mind, can we come back to that point? Because at the moment I'm just trying to establish the factual position, if you will, in terms of compliance with the core strategy, and we've more or less done that. I'll then move on to the trajectory, but this issue of delivery in the housing, of market housing in rural areas is an important point, which I do want to come back to, particularly when we look at the trajectory, and as you already pointed out, the delivery is within the first 5 years or so of the plan period rather than towards the latter end. So I think it is an important point we need to come back to. But if that's okay, I think we'll come back to it shortly. Okay, thank you for that. So I think unless anybody else wants to make any comments on the actual delivery and spatial distribution of new dwellings, I would like to move on to the trajectory itself, if all parties are accepting of that. In particular, the housing trajectory that is currently in the submission version of the Part 2 local plan has been revised. So I'm sure all parties have that updated document, which is for reference document SUB D7B. So we are going to concentrate our discussion in relation to that. But I'd like to bring the council in at this point and just ask that is the housing trajectory realistic, and what is the council's position on this?
The council do consider the trajectory to be realistic. Over the last couple of years, we've strengthened the housing trajectory subsequently after the NPPF revision. First came in I think July 2018 with the draft version, following with the revised version in 2019, February 2019. This was kind of the basis for the strengthening of our housing land supply statement, and the last two positions that we've published over the last 2 years. Within this, we have set out our evidence base and what that includes. Obviously, it sets out that the basis of this includes consulting with key stakeholders, which will include landowners, developers, site owners, as well as council officers, which may be involved with development management officers, property and services, and housing strategy as well. So it's a varied amount of people that we include when we're updating our housing trajectory and the evidence that informs this. The evidence base, so in the back of the housing land supply statement, which was published November 19, so the Reference is EBHOU1.
Yes.
Appendix 6, we set out the engagement that we've had between ourselves and the key stakeholders for the sites that you'd classify as category B in accordance to the NPPF definition of deliverability. This is where clear evidence is needed that the council has to provide within their housing land supply statements. So this kind of sets out the engagement we've had over the last year, really, and it's obviously council considers a fluid process. We have to continuously update that information, so we do the best we can to get the most up-to-date information at the point of publication, and that's what's presented in this document. But as well as that, we don't just accept the information that's been given to us by the stakeholders. We make sure that we check that for consistency against our local evidence. So we've taken on kind of from appeals in recent years, the feedback we've received in those, in particular in the last couple of years, we've had some appeals looking at our housing and supply. So we've taken that on and looked at it, providing a local evidence base as well as looking at national evidence. So Appendix 6 sets out this as well, where we've set out a number of tables which show our lead-in times and builder rates at a local level, as well as looking at the national study by Nathaniel Litchfield and partners. And we use this evidence to obviously make sure that the trajectories provided by developers are realistic. So in some cases, if they've suggested it will start in the next 2 years and we don't feel that's the case, looking at our local evidence, then we'll kind of amend that accordingly using that evidence base. And then we'll always go back to the developer to confirm this before we publish it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's clearly the trajectory is always a matter of judgment based on the evidence and the information that you have before you. So just to be clear then, in seeking evidence from individual developers, you then go and in effect sort of check that, you future-proof that, you assess it, you benchmark it against other data to come to your conclusion on whether it's realistic. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
Okay. That's fine, thank you. I know Mr. Lucas and Mr. Silcox want to come in on this point. So I'll bring Mr. Silcox in at this stage, please.
Thank you, ma'am. And apologies, I didn't introduce myself last time round.
All right.
So it's Sam Silcox on behalf of Wolf Management Asset Limited, who are working with Tata Steel, who are a big local employer. Yeah, it was just a couple of points there. And I think, you know, I support the council in terms of you know, speaking with landowners and the information they're looking at. I suppose perhaps where we differ perhaps is the conclusions reached on those points. And I think there's a couple of bits we pointed out, and I should at this stage declare I noticed a drafting error in my hearing statement. So I just wanted to point out that I think I sort of referred to an average delivery on Priors Hall for the last 4 years, which should have said 5 years.
Oh, okay.
And so, but it does make a difference in terms of the numbers. So just to be clear on that, yeah, if you look at the last 4 years, the average delivery is 184 units.
Which paragraph is from my note?
Oh,
Paragraph
I
reference.
don't think I've got paragraph numbers in my statement, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry, don't worry about it. It's fine. Yeah, I do recall the statement. Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry, I did notice that, so I thought I should declare it from the outset. Yeah, so the last 5 years is 184 units per annum, and the last 4 years would be 208 dwellings per annum. And I think that's quite interesting, really, because that is the big urban extension in Corby. It's the one local example we can draw upon, and is well below the numbers which we're being asked to sort of take forward through the plan period at the moment. So that's between 42 and 64 units per annum less than the sort of the higher figures we're achieving on both of the SUEs. And I think that's pertinent as well when we look at the addition of Corby West to the supply, because at that point we have competition in the market. We're not just proceeding as one developer, one site unencumbered. You know, where we've seen on Priors Hall, we've seen up to 11 outlets at one time. You know, that's pretty decent going by anyone's standards. And I think that's something we need to bear in mind, I suppose, about how realistic the figures are going forwards and whether we'll achieve those numbers. And there's just one final point, and Michelle mentioned the appeals that have happened recently. I was involved in one, and I was also involved in the background on another, having sort of acting for the landowner and monitoring the Gladman appeal. So I think it's fair to say I know the supply pretty well, having done 2 appeals on the matter. And I think we did see, for example, in one of those appeals, I think the numbers in the council's evidence went down to 160 dwellings per annum on their prior hall for the 5-year period. And we've now seen them jump back up again. And I think that is a pattern we have noticed through time. And I think we've seen it in the publication to the submission version. Numbers do jump around quite significantly on the sites without much explanation as to what's happening. And I think, from my view, I think the focus should be on, well, what does the evidence show us? What do the numbers show us? And we've looked at the local data. You know, it's 180 to 200 dwellings per annum. We mentioned the national data, and we looked at Nathaniel Litchfield Partners. And so that's exam reference EB HOU 10. Now there is a later version of that which was published this year, but in terms of, we look at the numbers, they are the same. They include 160 dwellings per annum on sites of 2,000 plus houses. They also confirm that sites with lower affordable housing provision deliver lower numbers of units, and I think that's the case here. We do have lower affordable housing numbers on these sites, which I believe is a question you did ask in the submission. I'm sure that's something that we'll come on to in due course, but I think those sites are delivering a lot less affordable housing than some of those urban extensions which do deliver at a higher rate, shall we say.
Right. So just to be clear, you're reasonably content with the overall approach the council takes in terms of collating various sources of information to enable them to develop a trajectory. It's the actual conclusions from monitoring the data that causes you more concern.
Yeah, I can't see what other information they've necessarily pull up on, really. I think you have to look at, you speak to the developers, that's all the landowners, it's a good starting point, and then you assess it. We look at the local evidence, we look at the national evidence. I think the thing is, local evidence and national evidence just don't simply support what the conclusions are, and we're quite a long way off where that evidence is pointing us.
Right. So in those circumstances, if I'm sure there are lots of examples of where local evidence will differ from national evidence and may differ from the averages that the Litchfield report tends to suggest. In that circumstance, would you suggest that greater weight should be given to the local evidence or the national average evidence?
I think in this instance, the national average and local are pretty close. So I think 160 on the national, 180 to 200 on the local. I think if we were to then, taking into account that Priors Hall has been operating in isolation from the rest at the moment, it may well be we see a slight dip in those numbers as a result of that competition coming into the marketplace. So I imagine somewhere between the two is probably about right in this instance. I think would be, around about that 170, 180 mark would be quite a realistic sort of estimate as to what might happen going forward, not rather than what's the optimal number we might achieve in a single year should we get everything right. And we've got all of our developers on site delivering away, and that's, which rarely happens, for lots of different reasons. And I won't go into them now, but there are lots of different reasons, obviously, why things can change and do happen. And these are complex sites ultimately, and they will deliver and they will do well, but perhaps not quite as well as being suggested.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Silcox. Can I invite Mr. Lucas? Your hand's up as well. Do you want to come in on this point, please?
Thank you, Mark. We're representing Mr. Griffiths of Stanion, and our concern is, as you've seen, on a number of sites that we've itemised. Hopefully we'll be able to go through those at some stage today.
Yes, we will do, yes.
Our concern, I agree with lots of what Mr. Silcox has just said, but actually what I wanted to make a point on, the housing delivery test, we've raised the bar. Last year, the bar was raised. There's got to be clear evidence. I've read through the information in the appendices on each particular site, and it's rather sketchy on some of it, Mum, actually, to be frank. And this is why we've talked about the previous inspector at the North Northamptonshire Joint Core Strategy raised the need for a 25% change in terms of housing supply. And he realised then, I didn't attend that one, but I attended West Northamptonshire. He realised then the issues in terms of sites not coming forward. And so that needs to be addressed. And I felt that the way that the sites were being reviewed, each particular site was reviewed, was a little sketchy, to be frank. And this is why I was saying, in this particular circumstance, quarterly updates are really quite a good way of going forward. We know that happens in a number of planning authorities we deal with, locally as well. And we find that is completely transparent and clear. And so everybody knows what's going on and questions can be asked, changes occur. We understand that happens. And I think that is one way forward in which Corby could adopt to address this particular issue on the number of sites that they've got where there are some concerns and there are problems. So that's the point I'd like to make at this stage, Mark, but hopefully we'll be going through some of those sites.
We will indeed. So I'm sure you'll have further comments shortly, Mr. Lucas. Thank you. Can I just go back to Ms. Shea from the council? Do you like to make any further comments on now you've heard what Mr. Lucas and Mr. Silcox have to say?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Firstly, in relation to the change in the projections at the SUEs each year, this, in my opinion, it has to be inevitable. It has to be based on the latest information available at that point. It's going to change based on market conditions and whatever else it may be. It can't just stay constant along. I mean, that, in my opinion, that would not be realistic to keep it at the same rate going forward every single year. So I appreciate what Mr. Silcox is saying, and I take that on board, but we don't accept that point really. We do consider the evidence as it comes in each year, and we look at our local evidence and review it that way. But we do feel like we have to review that each year and take on the evidence that we receive at that point in time. In relation to a quarterly update, I'm actually in the opinion that wouldn't help. That would actually probably make it worse for us. We do this in accordance with the NPPF that requires an annual update on housing land supply. And to do this any quicker, it would result in piecemeal updates, which would not be helpful. It takes us looking at least 6 months to update a housing land supply, to go back and forth between developers and actually make sure the information we've got is relevant and up to date and realistic. So to do this every quarter, in my opinion, would not be feasible.
Right, I think there is a clear resource implication in trying to do monitoring on a quarterly basis, and I know some authorities may do a 6 monthly update, but only for their own purposes rather than publishing and changing the actual annual housing requirement document. It might be something that you do as your ongoing monitoring, that you have that information in your hand. Is that something the council's considered?
We do. We are constantly updating housing land supply data in the background. We only do the one published document because at that point we've reviewed it enough to be able to publish it. But it's always gone on the background. Like I've mentioned earlier, we have obviously quite a lot of appeals going on in Corby. For the nature of it being a growth town, we do have a lot of applications up here. So we do constantly have to review our housing and land supply to make sure it is up to date, and we do try and update that through the appeal process and just throughout the year. We have quite a robust monitoring framework in Corby with the with Joint Core Strategy. So it is something we do in the background, but we believe that publishing this annually is adequate. Okay,
all right, thank you. What I'd like to move on to now is to just have a look at some of the individual sites, in particular the SUEs, the Sustainable Urban Extensions. A number of representatives have raised the issue that there is an over-reliance on the SUEs, and there is concerns about their delivery and whether or not the delivery will continue at the rate that the trajectory suggests. So I think what will be useful is to have a look at some of these sites in a little bit more detail, which I'm sure Mr. Lucas and Mr. Silcox would be very pleased to do. Can I ask the council to lead on this? So we start, say, with the Priors Hall site. Could you take us through that one in terms of the past performance and your assessment of its ongoing delivery through the trajectory?
Yes, so Priors Hall is obviously the first SUE that started developing Corby. It will be a total of 5,100 homes over 3 zones. Zone 1 now is getting towards the nearing completion. It's developed at March 2019. There's been 1,137 dwellings completed at that site so far.
March 19?
March 19, which is the position that's in the 5-year housing land supply statement.
Yeah, okay.
So we've delivered a significant amount of housing so far at Priors Hall, at Zone 1. This has also been complemented with other developments, such as a secondary school that opened in 2008 and a primary school opened in 2016. There's also been an office and a cafe in the last year. So other development is going on site supporting the infrastructure, not necessarily just transport, but obviously including education and social. So there's a lot going on that site constantly, and we're receiving a lot of applications. Almost monthly. It's quite an active site. We've included all the applications within the council response to the inspector's initial questions. We set out in a table in Appendix 4 with all the applications we've received, which just demonstrates the activity that's happening there. With zones 2 and 3, the application came in July 2019. That is in the process of getting towards going towards committee to.
Is that reserved matters?
Pardon?
Is that a reserved matters application?
So that's an outline application for zones 2 and 3, and it's for I believe 4,000. It could be 4,500 homes. Apologies if that's not completely correct. It's around 4,000.
Right. Okay.
Zones 2 and 3. So far, it's been an application for permanent access road between zones 2 and zones 1. So that's going to kind of bring the infrastructure forward go forward into the next zone. But that application is still pending, and it's with our development case officer at the moment, who's working alongside developer to get that in as soon as possible and get that at committee. But in terms of delivery of the housing, it has been continuous since it began. I believe in 2010 we saw the first completion. We accept that obviously sometimes it has been lower than we projected, but in recent years it has been improving. We've had some very good rates in the last couple of years at Priors Hall, demonstrating that the conditions there have been good, and we project that this will continue going forward. It kind of aligns with as well when Urban Civic took over that site in 2017. The development has really been pushing forward.
Right, okay. Yeah, I can see from the information that you've submitted in your evidence that Priors Hall has started off a little bit slowly.
Yes.
It has under-delivered in some of the earlier years, certainly 2016, 17. But then from then onwards, it has improved, which is very, very common for such a site of this size, for it to pick up speed as it progresses, as the infrastructure is put into place. So I think that's good. Mr. Silcox or Mr. Lucas, is there any particular comments you want to make on Priors Hall?
None whatsoever from me, Mum.
Thank you. Mr. Silcox.
Just a quick observation, really. I think you say the last couple of years we've seen improve the delivery there, and that's with zone 1 fully up and running, getting to those larger numbers. So that's coming to an end now. We're going to see a move on to zones 2 and 3. We've got outline applications outstanding, reserve matters need to be submitted, land deals need to be done. It's not to say that now we've reached that peak, we're going to continue along that line. We've got phases within this, and I think we will see those variations within it. And all we'd advocate for is sort of seeking that sort of what's a reasonable average to be delivered across the plan period. And I think, I think that's that's where I would see where the conclusion needs to be reached.
Thank you. Yeah, so, Ms. Shave from the council. I think it is a good point that Mr. Silcox is raising there. If there is an outline application in July, which has yet to be determined, there will clearly be a little bit of a lead-in time from that being signed, possibly legal agreements to be signed, land deals to be sorted out, submission of reserve matters, discharge of conditions, starting on site, and then actually delivery on the ground. Are you still confident that that particular site, certainly zones 1, 2 and 3, are going to deliver in line with the trajectory that you're suggesting?
Yes, we do believe so. This is obviously, like I say, based on the latest evidence available at this time. We will continue to review and monitor the progress of this site and make sure that our latest projection does reflect the actual rate at that point. So going forward in our next housing land supply statement, it may be that it's not going to be as feasible anymore, but at this point in time we do feel like it is realistic. At the moment, zones 2 and 3, so in terms of infrastructure there, the earthworks has been prepared there, so the land is being prepared at the moment. Obviously appreciate there are steps in between before delivery will start in zones 2 and 3, but we still do have four main areas of land still to commence in Zone 1, which will kind of hopefully continue the delivery up until that point where the reserve matters are approved. So there's still 4 sites which will so include, there's one of the 4 sites at Zone 1 is for 75 units, and applications just come in now. So it's like a step in process really. That should hopefully continue until Zones 2 and 3 are at that stage where they're going to start commencing. But the groundworks are being prepared, so hopefully that's in preparation for it when it is approved.
Right, okay, thank you. On Price Hall Park, can I just question, I'm not sure whether the discrepancy between documents here, and it might well be that things have changed, but looking at Appendix 6A of the 5-year housing land supply document, that has certain conclusions on the number of dwellings that are likely to come forward in Zones 1, 2 and 3 and being deliverable over the 5-year period. Now that totals, according to my calculation, 759. Yeah, the trajectory includes 1,187 dwellings for the first 5 years. So I just wonder whether am I missing something here? Can you explain that for me?
Yes, I believe the difference will be, so the Appendix A to, I believe, H, that is only regarding the sites which we consider category B of the NPPF definition of deliverability. So all the sites that are currently live with detailed planning applications and are under construction, they are set out earlier in the 5-year housing land supply document. So it doesn't include everything. So what's outlined in Appendix 6A isn't everything that's delivering at Price Hall. It's the ones where we need to provide extra evidence.
So why do you need to provide extra evidence?
As in clear evidence, sorry.
Okay, right. Right, okay, that explains it. So the actual trajectory takes account of other sites coming forward that you feel will be deliverable within the 5-year supply.
Yes, that's correct. I was just going to try and get the reference for you to help of what table would demonstrate everything. Just trying to get the right page. Okay, so Appendix 2 sets out category A sites according to the NPPF definition of deliverability. And then the second page on page 16 sets out the sites that you're referring to in Appendix 6A.
Right, okay, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't some error there that we needed to pick up on, that because that clearly is a significant difference there. So we wanted to make sure that it was right. Okay, excellent. Okay then, should we move on to Weldon Park? I mean, this is actually far more advanced, but it's a smaller site anyway. Can you give me some comments on Weldon Park and its past performance and how it's going to continue over the planned period?
Yes, ma'am, that's absolutely fine. So Weldon Park is a smaller SUE. It's around 1,000 dwellings, which comprises with Price Hall to make up North East Corby SUE, which is set out in the diagram, key diagram in the JCS. So the master plan was approved in 2014, and the site commenced around in 2016-17, and it has been consistently delivering since the beginning. So far, at 31st of March 19, there's been 212 completions at Weldon Park. There's been no evidence to suggest that this won't continue. It's been a strong delivery at this site from the beginning, as I've said. So we're confident that this will continue. We've had confirmation that there's been, the applicant has recently confirmed that phase 2 has reached to phase 2 for the neighbourhood play area. So that's now been implemented from the Section 106. So there's been no signs of anything slowing down at Weldon Park, to our knowledge.
Right, okay, yeah, I think Weldon Park is probably one that we don't need to discuss a great deal. It seems to be performing reasonably well. I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about West Corby, the SUE, in particular, the delivery of that and where it's up to. So for the starting point, it might be helpful if you just outline in brief terms where this particular site is up to in terms of planning permissions, outline permission, and your assumptions that you have made in your trajectory on this particular site.
Yes, so West Corby was granted outline permission in December 2019 for 4,500 dwellings, and this included the Section 106 agreement and accompanying that. So there's a latest PPA agreement is due to be signed this autumn. That's currently ongoing discussions between the case officer, the developer, and between landowner and the landowner as well to get the final details confirmed. So that's ongoing in the background. The developer
on the YouTube channel, PPA is a planning performance agreement, which is basically a timetable of how the site's going to come forward.
Yes, no, that's correct. Yes, that's
Sorry,
I should have said that out. Apologies.
No, it's all right, don't worry.
So the site developer, we've been in the background trying to start the process of updating housing land supply again, ready for the next AMR submission, which will be early next year. And we've had confirmation in July this year that the discharge of conditions will commence from this November. And the first reserve matters will hopefully be due around October, so around this time next year, October 2021. At the moment, they're projecting that phase 1 will commence in June 2022, with the first completion projected 2025. I just want to add, though, this is data that I haven't had a chance to analyse as such yet. This is just raw data received from the developer, the latest status. We haven't gone back and forward yet with them to discuss this any further. This is just the initial information I've received from them. Obviously, the information we've got in our housing land supply document sets out the evidence at this point in time, our published evidence. We've gone back and forward with the developer and our case officer to set out the structure we've included in our housing land supply statement. I'm just going to get to that now.
Right, okay. Okay, thank you. I think what concerns me about West Corby as an SUE is clearly, I think I said in our previous comment, these very large sites do take a little while to start getting going, and that is usually the case on all of them. In terms of the position with West Corby, we have an outline permission in December 19. From what you just said to me there, reserve matters you're looking at for October 21, and then completions in 2025. So can we relate that to the trajectory? In terms of your expectations at the moment? Sorry, carry on.
Apologies. I appreciate it is different to what's in the trajectory, but this is obviously the latest information I've got to hand. I haven't had a chance to obviously analyse this against our housing land supply statement and to look into updating this. But the information in our 5-year housing land supply statement obviously is the latest published statement we've got this time, what we've been able to review. So obviously the information we had at the point of publication of that document is correct at that point in time.
Yes, I understand that, and I do appreciate these things are a moving feast. They're moving on and changing all the time as negotiations and discussions continue. But the key point here, I think, is, which I think you've already alluded to, is that you need to go back and have a look in detail at this trajectory for West Corby, particularly as at the moment the actual document suggests 20 dwellings being delivered in 21-22, and then picking up over future years. So at the moment you've got 3 years of the current 5-year housing land supply relying on partly relying on West Corby, and then continuing 150 in 24-25, then 250 units thereafter to the end of the plan period. So that I do appreciate you need to go away and do some further work on this, and it may well be what I might ask you to do is to prepare for a paper on this to provide you your current position once that information has been confirmed. But the key point I think here is clearly it's now looking like West Corby is going to be delayed significantly with completions coming along in 2025 when you're envisaging 21-22. That's quite a significant delay. So the key issue is what is the impact of that delay in terms of the ability for that site to deliver over the plan period. So what's the council's view on that? I know it's information that you only just currently have, but what's your initial view on the implications of that?
It's something that we'll continue to monitor and view throughout the process, really, and throughout the next year and going forward. Appreciate that it is quite different in the expected delivery years, but this is initial information and it's not something I can just take at hand. I'd like to review that properly before we can confirm that figure, and obviously have further discussions with the case officer as well, who's obviously working alongside the developer. But we'll continue to monitor it to make sure that we've taken the steps to address that in our housing and supply statement.
Right, okay, as I said, I think what I'll need you to do then is to produce me another paper on this particular site and how it's going to affect the overall trajectory and delivery throughout the plan period, because certainly if it's delayed by, say, 3 years, potentially you've got 750 units dropping off the end of the plan period in terms of delivery, and that could potentially have significant implications for your ability to meet the JCS requirements. So it is an important point that I'm afraid that we will need to have some further evidence on that particular issue to see what the implications of that are. Mr. Lucas, don't I bring you in at this point, please?
Well, I think I've heard most of it. You stole my thunder.
Oh, sorry. Well, is there anything further you'd like to say then, Mr. Lucas?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, I've always felt that, you know, this has been yo-yoing backwards and forwards, the amount that's coming from this site in the last 12 months. And I'm sure Mr. Silcock's been looking at it for a longer period than I have, since 2016. And it's yo-yoing backwards and forwards. But 2 points I wanted to make. 271 homes annotated in the current going to be built out within 41 months. I've always thought that was ridiculous personally, but we've now heard what's happening, and I thought that would have been updated as part of this plan. Fine, that's good. Well, the second point I wanted to make was at the Gretton inquiry, it was stated quite clearly in the statement of common ground that the council stated that the applicant, i.e. West Corby, expects to submit the first reserve matters application within 2 months of the outline consent being granted. Well, obviously that's 8 months ago, and now we've heard what's happening, and thank you very much for explaining the PPA, Mum. I was getting a bit worried about that. That's very useful. And actually, yes, it actually puts the whole equation back, and it's a big question mark I've had, and I'm sure Mr. Silcock's had, throughout, but we've had this since 2016, every particular housing land update. So that's all I wanted to say at this point, Mum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lucas. Right, I don't think we can take West Corby any further, unfortunately, today, because of that's undated information, and I appreciate the council need to go away and consider the implications of that. What I would like to have a look at, though, is in general terms, in terms of lead-in times and build-out rates, I think there are questions that we need to ask in relation to delivery on West Corby generally, and also on Priors Hall, in that they certainly beyond the 5-year supply from 24-25, we're looking at 250 units coming forward on an annual basis. And is that a realistic assumption? We've heard from Mr. Lucas already today that in his view, it could be around about 170, 180 is probably realistic. And looking at the delivery from Priors Hall, I think over the last 3 years, and they haven't achieved 750 over 3 years, I think it's 662. So he's a little bit low. Can I ask the council, Ms. Shave, could you come in here and just help us with that assumption, bearing in mind your local evidence on build-out rates, plus the national averages that everybody's aware of? Is it realistic to assume that these larger sites could potentially provide 250 dwellings on an annual basis?
Yeah, we do consider it to be realistic. I mean, the nature of these sites, there's a lot of parcels that are delivering at one point. For numerous reasons, Priors Hall unfortunately had slower delivery than projected for a number of years. It could be for a number of reasons, but we've proven in the last couple of years that, so in 2017-18, there was 269 completions at Priors Hall, and then last year there was 238, which is not far off the 250 projected in the long-term period. And obviously in 2017 it was above the 250 mark. So we've proven that it is possible in recent years when the market conditions are there. Obviously it can depend, it can go up and down, and our evidence always supports the latest information we have by changing it each year upon year. We don't keep it the same because it has to be based upon the latest evidence. But we do feel like it is realistic, and we have proven in recent years that it is happening, and delivery is reaching those levels at Priors Hall. Priors and Weldon Park, obviously, even though it's a smaller SUE, it's still proven that it's delivering beyond what was projected. I mean, last year at Weldon Park in 2018-19, it delivered 111 dwellings in 1 year. projected only to deliver 60. So the strength in the housing market it is there. Corby is a growth town, as I mentioned earlier. It's one of the fastest growing in the country outside of London, and the delivery rates kind of are showing that in recent years. So we do feel that it is realistic and it is based on local evidence. Clearly, there are going to be times when it's going to be lower, but we've proven it can reach those levels.
Okay, yeah, I think I was looking at Price Hall when I was suggesting it had delivered. I think over the 2016-19, it delivered 662 in total, which is, if you're assuming 250 a year, then that is a little bit below the 750 that would be the average over 3 years. I accept that it varies, and certainly Weldon Park has exceeded expectations in 18-19 and done extremely well. I do accept that there are variations within that, and we have to take a realistic and proportionate judgment on it, really. But can I bring Mr. Silcox in? Your hand's up at the moment.
Thank you, Mum. Yeah, it's just a very quick point, really, and it's just building on what I've said previously. But I think it is important to look at sort of averages within that. I mean, taking sort of short scale views on a couple of years to sort of meet a number doesn't necessarily respond to how these things will evolve. And no doubt we will see issues going forward. We will see delays. You know, it's worth remembering as well that these SUEs started out in 2008 as well. So this core strategy is a review of the original core strategy. And obviously we've had, since 2008, obviously had various views which not once have been delivered. And we've always fallen back, and we've always found a new problem or a new issue that's evolved. And I think it would be a mistake at this stage to say there are going to be no problems going forward now. We've resolved it all. We're off we go. We're going to hit those high numbers now. For those 2 years, we've resolved all the issues. We've got 11 outlets on site. We're going to be delivering like that going forwards. I think to be realistic, we have to assume that there will be other issues that go forwards, and these sites will deliver well at points and they'll deliver less well at other points. And I think that's probably, it's just taking that balanced view is all that we're advocating, really.
No, thank you. That's a very reasonable approach. Yeah, no, thank you for that. Can I just spend a few minutes just looking at the implications with the SUEs? Now, I am aware that the core strategy, I just can't remember the paragraph reference at the top of my head, but basically there is a trigger within the core strategy that suggests that if the SUEs are not delivering as envisaged by the core strategy's trajectory over a period of 3 years, if that delivery is under 75%, that could potentially trigger a review of the core strategy. Now, I do appreciate that the council has revised its projections on each of the SUEs on an annual basis with the 5-year housing land supply. Those revisions have, in effect, reduced the levels of delivery on those sites, and some of those projections have proved to be reasonably accurate in terms of what has happened. But in reducing those projections, the trajectory in the core strategy is being further and further undermined, in that expectation is clearly not being achieved now. Can I just ask the council to comment on what is the position with the trigger in terms of the JCS and these particular SUEs?
So the status in Corby really is set out in table 3 of the council's matter statement, matter 3. So in the previous 3 years, the council's demonstrated it delivered 83.96% of the projected housing completions at the SUEs that are projected in, the trajectory set out in Appendix 4, Appendix A of the JCS. So our current position is in the previous 3 years, we've actually delivered 83.96%. So the trigger isn't engaged in Corby at this time. Furthermore, paragraph 2.20 of the council's matter statement makes reference to the North Northamptonshire Joint Planning Committee report, July 2019, reference JCS SD5. This explains that the SUE performance alone shouldn't necessarily necessitate an immediate review of the JCS, because although it's lower than planned in the JCS, across North Northamptonshire, we've proven we've got 5-year housing land supply, which is supplemented by our evidence bases. We consider our evidence base to be realistic, and at this point, we are proving that we've got beyond the 75% delivery at SUEs, albeit lower than the target is still above the 75% that's required before it be triggered.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I have seen that in your hearing statement, and that committee report is actually quite helpful to explain the situation. I've got two hands up here. Can I ask Mr. Jameson, Councillor Solicitor, do you wish to comment on this point further, please?
Thank you, Mark. If I could put this trigger in context, and I was there at both the core strategy examinations for the North Northamptonshire JPU, and indeed, I can confess that the wording is probably mine on the 75%. And it arose thus because an inspector was saying, well, you are placing a great deal of reliance on the SUEs. Now, I need to know what happens if those SUEs don't deliver, if I'm to find this plan sound. So I need you to convince me to go away and say, well, through monitoring, how are you going to cope with this? And we said, well, here is a method, the 75% for 3 successive years, which will set alarm bells ringing and may trigger a review. But the point I really want to make is I think you have to think really hard before adding additional sites at part 2 level, because what that then does, I mean, it diverts resources away from the strategic sites inevitably, perhaps impinges on their performance, diverts infrastructure to other projects, maybe easier to deliver, and undermines to a certain extent the approach of the SUEs as the primary vehicle for delivery. And so what we would say is that this is properly to be dealt with before we start undermining the SUEs. This is properly to be dealt with at the joint core strategy level, because if there is a failure to deliver, the answer won't be pepper potting additional sites in the individual districts. It'll be to take a review across the joint planning unit area as a whole and to see how you might best remedy it, building on additional infrastructure and not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think it's, I hope, useful to put that point in at the moment, Ma'am.
No, thank you, Mr. Jameson. That is a very valid point, and that clearly is the implication of the trigger effectively. I mean, what it's requiring is that a more fundamental review of the strategic delivery rather than tinkering around at, if I can use that phrase, at the non-strategic level. But clearly, from my perspective, I need to be ensured that the Part 2 plan can deliver the requirements of the core strategy, which is why I think we need to explore in a little bit more depth the implications of West Corby. So, which is clearly, I've already asked for some further work on that and a further paper to look at those implications. But that's clearly is the perspective that I'm tackling this from. But thank you for that. Can I bring Mr. Silcox in, please?
Thank you, Mum. I think, yeah, just on the point of triggers, I think the Gladman statement identified in the 3 years prior to this that the 75 trigger had been met and the review hadn't been taken forwards. And I think, in my statement, I looked to the first 3 years of the plan going forwards, and again, that 75% trigger will be met again. We'll see that, first 3 years of the plan were projected to fall below that monitoring target, which raises a great starting point. And we've also, depending on your conclusions on other sites, will ultimately conclude how well the council are performing and whether they're meeting their 20% buffer as originally set out in the publication plan. But perhaps with that combination of the buffer not being met and we're expecting these numbers to fall below what was originally projected and diluting, as you pointed out on the numbers in the core strategy, perhaps that is a sensible thing to include in this plan is a review. I don't think this plan is going to solve the problems in itself. I don't think that there are mechanisms for doing that. I think there's scope for an element of additional sites in other locations, and that for not just numbers, but also for providing that range of sites. And I don't think we'd be diluting the big urban extensions where you've got your big national house builders. All we're doing is we're complementing it by allowing other developers to get on board. I mean, to give you an idea, the sites I've worked on locally have included a local company called Granary Developments who do sites of 15 to 30 units. Mulberry did a site of 30 units. albeit I've done another site. We did a affordable housing scheme in Corby for 20 years. These are the sort of sites which these guys aren't going to go on to the urban extensions. These are guys which are going to be shut out from the market going forward. I think that's just moving away from the original point, really. And I think it's just highlighting that those provisions for a review, as per the council's own committee report, may well be in a position where they're being met at the current time. And actually, the way of dealing with that is to put a review mechanism in here to ensure that does happen going forwards, rather than perhaps a paper in a year's time saying we've looked at it, but we don't really fancy going to do a review at the moment. We'll push that down the line. And then that's a way of giving confidence to all involved that that matter will be rectified going forwards.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. Mr. Lucas.
Yeah, I just want to say one point, probably what I've already said, but this to me, and this is what the previous inspector was absolutely clear about, we need clear and effective hands-on monitoring. And to my mind, despite the appendices and the detail in the appendices, that is not evident. There is not clarity in a number of those sites as to going forward with effective development and completions. So I think the PPA agreement, which you've highlighted, absolutely essential, Mark. And without us addressing this issue, you've got control of the housing market by a small number of landowners and developers, and that is an issue. And I'm sure Mr. Silcox would agree with me on that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, when we look at our next session this morning, when we look at the individual allocations, that's one of the points I want to pick up on is the monitoring information and the trajectory. So I think we are going to look into that to a degree, a little bit in more detail later on this morning with the other matter. I think that's probably all as far as we can take it in terms of the trajectory to a degree this morning. But what I'd like to return to is the point that Mr. Silcox made initially in terms of the delivery in the rural areas and the need for possibly further provision within the rural areas for market housing towards the latter end of the plan period. It is clear from the trajectory that it's envisaged that the majority of the dwellings within the rural area are within the first 5 years or so of the plan. And it is a question of what happens with the later years of the plan. I am aware of the exception policy within the core strategy and the policy within the Part 2 plan for custom and self-build. But I think it's an important point to explore whether or not there should be some further provision within the rural area, accepting that the Part 2 plan has exceeded the core strategy requirement of 120 dwellings in those areas. So can I bring Ms. Shea back in to comment on that particular point, please?
Thanks, ma'am. We do consider the housing strategy obviously sets out the number of housing it's going to deliver in the rural areas, and I don't obviously want to relay the point too much, but it does project that going forward from this point until the end of the plan, there's an additional 112 dwellings expected to complete across the rural villages in Corby. Appreciate that maybe the last 4 years, as Mr. Silcox picked up, that there isn't anything showing our trajectory for the rural areas. However, we have evidenced since the beginning of the plan period what we've delivered through windfall sites. So although there's not anything permitted at this point, you tend to find that the rural areas do deliver smaller sites. They won't have permission yet, they won't even be in the planning process yet, but they will, based on previous evidence, we have no reason to suggest that windfall sites will continue to come through as the plan progresses. So we consider the current trajectory, it's proven that the current policy framework is effective, it is working, we are delivering rural housing. We've also got 5 neighbourhood plans at different stages in Corby, which will also be able to deliver rural housing. Gretton's at the most advanced stage at the moment, but we have got others which are in different stages and that are progressing at different levels. And they have the opportunity to deliver rural housing, both market and affordable, where their needs are set out. And as I say, with windfall sites, we consider that is sufficient, and we don't think it's appropriate at this point to deviate from the JCS strategy, spatial strategy that requires the housing to be met within the most sustainable location within Corby town.
Right, okay, thank you. Can I bring Mr. Lucas in on this point? You raised this initially. Sorry,
Yeah.
not Mr. Yeah, I'll take Mr. Lucas, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. Obviously, we've made some comments in our statements on this, and we are in front of you tomorrow, Mark. Presumably, we might be discussing aspects of this, but actually, the inspector's quite clear in the JCS. There's no cap on rural housing. It's the implication from CBC, Corby Borough Council, that there is a very restricted development policy based upon something that predates 2015 and doesn't take accord of the 2019 National Planning Policy Framework. If one goes forward on 120 units, one is only looking at 6 units in the rural area per year. I mean, that is bizarre, Mark. And to my mind, it doesn't take account of the government guidance, and there has to be further rural development. But obviously, that is based upon housing needs across the board, and totally across the board, not just on rural exception sites, on market housing as well. And I do commend CBC for actually getting Midlands Rural Housing to actually go forward looking at housing needs surveys. They've actually done a good job. That's good. But obviously, at the end of 3 years, that is dated, and that needs to be updated. And that is always a worry. And I know Mr. Silcox mentioned that previously. We need to look again at rural housing needs across the board. And those 2016 documents need to be updated, continuously updated. And there's no reason why the rural area, sustainable rural settlements, shouldn't have further housing. I can't see the problem.
Right, okay. In reference to the 2016 documents, that's the Rural Needs Survey, Rural Housing Needs Survey, which I have asked a question on the MOQs about that. It does identify the need for housing in certain settlements, certain villages. And one of the questions I posed was, how is that addressed in the plan? So you are not content then with the council's view that the core strategy policy for development within the rural areas that will bring forward potentially windfall development, and that will provide for that further rural housing if that's needed. So you think there needs to be more in terms of a policy position to make the plan sound?
Yeah, issues. With the greatest respect to CBC, this is a plan for Corby Town, effectively. I understand that, but this is a Part 2 plan. We've got from 1997, 23 years ago. There's a whole generation has gone forward. I mean, this is now, and you've got 2 pages on the rural area. I don't think that's sufficient. It needs to be a broader base based upon what the government guidance is, and the government guidance is much more proactive, as you've seen, and we've made comments on that, Mark. And I know you will have read those. But yes, I do believe that there needs to be a really good in-depth look at the rural areas, which hasn't been undertaken thus far. And as you know, we've talked about our parish health checks and all that sort of information. Thankfully, the neighbourhood plans have taken up the cudgel, and in most of the larger rural settlements, neighbourhood plans are progressing. What I don't want to see happen is the, dare I say it, it's an awful thing I'm going to say now, the dead hand of CBC with their town-generated policy, restricting development in the rural areas with those settlement boundaries. And that worries me. And presumably we'll be talking about that tomorrow.
Yes, we will be, yes. Right, okay. So can I bring Mr. Silcox in then at this point for his views?
Thank you, Mum. Yeah, I'll try not to repeat things that Mr. Lucas have just said. I think just picking up on his first point, though, I just point to paragraph 9.19 in the core strategy, which talks about the numbers for the rural area being the baseline level of growth. I think it refers to rather than a sort of a maximum target or anything of that sort of nature. And we have got scope for local needs and opportunities to be met in the rural area. They can't be met in the growth town, and we've seen that the growth town, I think, is arguably struggling to deliver its own needs at the moment, let alone those of the rural areas. So I think there is an environment here where potentially needs, there are needs which potentially now and evolving as the plan goes on. I think, as Mr. Lucas pointed out, we will see the local housing needs, the local needs evolve, and that's the nature of those sorts of sites. I mean, I'm involved in lots of exception sites, and those housing needs surveys are updated every 3 to 5 years, and you then look to address the needs as it arises, or doesn't, as the case may be. And I think that's possibly where I'm coming from, in that there should be flexibility within the plan to allow to meet those local needs. Mr. Miss Shea absolutely correct in saying that the neighbourhood plans are coming forwards. One is advanced, the other four they've got an identified area, but they've had no progress in the last 2 or 3 years, and so we don't know what their intentions are. If they come forward and look to deliver housing in a positive way, good, fantastic. Then that's their prerogative to do so. But I do think building in flexibility here, and that may be whether that's a policy for an exception type site, for where there's local housing need for market housing as well, if that's identified, or flexibility within settlement boundaries policy, which allows for those things to happen if wind fills and neighbourhood plans aren't delivering as we are expecting, would be sort of a robust way of providing that sort of backstop position built into a plan. I should say I've been involved in a number of windfall sites in the rural area, and they are. I must admit, I think we may have exhausted some of those opportunities, but there probably aren't too many coming forwards. And a number of the sites we've been looking at, sites which are allocated in, where they have been formally allocated in previous plans, and they've been around for years, and we've overcome issues that are addressed with them. And but I don't. Yeah, I think there is good justification, I think, providing that flexibility in the plan at this stage to allow that to happen.
Okay, so in providing that flexibility, how would you like to see the plan change to achieve that? How do you feel the plan needs to evolve to make it sound in this regard?
I think you could either include a policy which was similar to policy 13 in the plan, which allowed for local market needs to be met. There's a reason why the local needs assessments are including the market housing in there as well, is because it's something which we accept needs to be monitored. And so maybe if there's a proven unmet need in that regard, that would then justify the release of or development on a particular site to make it have to come forwards. Alternatively, it could be looking at the settlement boundaries and the way in which they're addressed, and rather than having tightly drawn boundaries, there could be perhaps a detailed policy which had those sort of criteria. And again, sort of within there, you could build in that flexibility to say something on the lines of where there's an unmet housing need, that would be, as long as it's in the well-related locations, the built-up form or whatever, that the type of language you expect to see in that type of policy. But I think in doing that, you build the flexibility to meet these needs as they evolve.
Okay, yes, as Mr. Lucas has already alluded to, we are going to be looking tomorrow morning at the village settlement boundaries and the implications of those. So I'm sure this is something we're going to come back to. But can I bring Ms. Shavin from the council? Can I just have your further points on this, please?
Thank you. Just a point firstly, that over the last couple of years, obviously since the publication of the revised NPPF, this has been supplemented by housing delivery tests. In the last two, we proved that we had 130% delivery against the housing requirement. Following that,
just repeat that for me, please.
Yeah, sorry. So the housing delivery test results that in February 2019 confirmed that Corby has delivered 113% of its housing requirement in the previous 3 years.
Right. Thank you.
This year's release confirmed that it's delivered 127% of its housing requirement over the previous 3 years. The point for me for raising this is at this moment in time, it's been proven, and obviously the housing delivery test was brought in for the reason to assess under delivery from my knowledge, and to make sure obviously is a method of monitoring that and addressing that. And then I'd like to point to policy 11 in the JCS, paragraph D. It does state that if it is necessary to identify additional sites to maintain a 5-year housing land supply of land in a district in accordance with policy 28, these should be identified at the growth town, followed if necessary and relevant by the market towns within that district. So I just wanted to kind of relay that point that if it was the point that we didn't have enough housing, which we don't consider is the case at the moment, but going forward, if that was the case, we wouldn't be looking to the rural areas initially, we'd be looking within the growth town. And that's what obviously the approach the Part 2 local plan has taken with the housing allocations, which we discussed later today. But I just wanted to kind of relay that point that we are working in accordance with the core strategy, which focuses in the growth town because they are the most sustainable locations. And we've already demonstrated in my earlier point with our housing trajectory and what we've included for rural housing, that we consider the policy framework to be effective with the policies in JCS at this time.
Okay, thank you for that. That's a good point. But how do you marry that approach? Clearly, you're delivering housing in line with the spatial strategy for the JCS, which is absolutely fine. But in so doing, how does that respond to the findings of the Rural Housing Needs Surveys that are saying that there is a need for further housing in some of those rural areas? So how do you marry the two together?
Well, Policy 11 obviously allows for infill developments in rural areas. So where there's need for specific housing, that can come through via Policy 11 and infill developments. And obviously there's the rural exception site in Policy 13. So I feel like that framework there, it does allow for the Rural Housing Needs Survey, which sets out the certain need, or it addresses that through the current policy framework. And in addition to that, obviously, as already mentioned, neighbourhood plans are able to address their particular needs as well.
Right, okay, thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting comment. Thank you. Mr. Lucas, do you wish to come back in and point your hands up there?
Well, it just shows how restrictive things are in terms of the JCS policy base that Corby are working forward in this Part 2 local plan. Well, obviously, yet again, I say this is the first local plan in 23 years that looks at detailed level in terms of rural housing, and actually those comments, that doesn't equate to the February 2018 NPPF. And I'm concerned about that, and so I agree with Mr. Silcox looking at alternative policies and how to move that wording through in an effective policy base without looking at a JCS review, and that's what concerns me. And so
yeah, I think that's a good point here, because effectively what I'm examining here is a Part 2 plan, and a Part 2 non-strategic plan clearly has to have conformity with the parent core strategy, if you will.
yes.
Possibly what you're referring to here, it may well point to more of a review of the core strategy and the spatial approach within that document, rather than looking at modifications to the Part 2 plan. So what's your view of that?
Well, I don't know. I'm so pleased that the neighbourhood planning is moving forward in this district, in a big way, which is good. And my reason for that is moving forward, I think, is because this whole area, in terms of the rural area, it's a very attractive rural area, don't get me wrong. It has been, it's all been about growth at Corby Town. The rural area has been forgotten. And thankfully, the residents in the rural area have taken up neighbourhood plans, and that is good. So I see a way forward, hopefully strategically, without a strategic block, Ma'am.
All right, thank you. Mr. Jameson, can I bring you in at this point, please?
Thank you, Ma'am. It's just building on the point that you made. If there is to be a change in approach to the rural areas as a result of a change in national policy since the JCS was adopted, then that would have to be reflected in a changed approach to the rural areas in the Joint Core Strategy review. What I don't think it's open for us to do in a Part 2 plan, which relies entirely for its policy framework on the Joint Core Strategy, is to say, well, we're going to preempt that review and move off in a direction of our own towards rural areas, because you've immediately then got a conflict with the policy and the Joint Core Strategy. And I know you've got this point, Ma'am, but the whole time, I mean, Mr. Lucas perhaps suggests a root and branch different approach to the rural areas as a result of a change in government policy. Well, the Part 2 plan is not the place to do that, Ma'am. It's going to have to be tackled at the strategic level because it's a strategic issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jameson. I've got hands up still from Mr. Lucas and Mr. Silcox. Do you wish to come back on a point, or are your hands still there and need to come down? Mr. Silcox, do you wish to make a further point?
Yes, please. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the point about conformity with the core strategy, and I'd like to think that the comments I've made today have been with very much in view of the policies set out within that and looking to work with them. I'd refer again to policy 29, which does talk about ensuring the phasing so that those sites across the plan period available in the rural area, which we're not doing at the moment. And so there is scope for identifying additional sites in that context. We have to comply with the plan as a whole. Similarly, if we pick out policy 11, Shay's pointed out that factually some points from there, but it also allows for the Part 2 plan to identify additional sites where there's a local need or opportunity, and where it can't be met in a more sustainable settlement nearby. And we've already identified issues with delivery at Corby. And so the rural area does need to bend for itself in that context. I think both of those things do suggest that the measures which we're talking about here, when that may be a couple additional sites, or it could be through flexibility or whatever, would be in conformity with the plan. They're not going to undermine the strategy that was put forward. And we need to read those policies together. So I did listen to the session yesterday, and the focus was on policy 11. But I do think policy 29 is important in that context, and it's we need to read those policies together and sort of generate a picture which works for both of those policies and delivers all those points. Those policies are equally important, and they need to both be met. And if that needs a few extra sites in the rural area, well, then so be it. But and it may be timeframes are calling upon them, whatever it may be. But ultimately, there is scope. You're not going to rectify fundamental issues in the plan. We're not going to deliver thousands of houses in the rural area. You're talking about small allocate. It might be 20 here, 20 there. I mean, that's the extent of what we're talking about. Really, we're not talking about 1,000 houses which are going to compete with Weldon Park. It's just that's not in the scope of your gift or anyone else's gift, and that's very much where we think. Then that goes back to my comments about a review being built into the plan, in acknowledgement that this isn't the place to rectify those more fundamental issues in terms of delivery on the larger sites, and also, which we may come on to in a minute, but the failure with the strategic opportunity and the lost benefits, the numerous benefits which were expected to be delivered from that, which won't happen anymore. So I think there's two approaches there, and I'd like to think we were in conformity with the core strategy.
Right, no, that's a helpful point. Thank you for that. Mr. Lucas, anything further lastly from yourself?
All I can say is I totally agree with what Mr. Silcox has said, and also the Inspector Payne, who looked at both West Northamptonshire and North Northamptonshire joint core strategies, made exactly the same point in both of them. There is no cap on rural housing. We've just got to look at the strategic implications of any significant changes, and exactly that point made by Mr. Silcox. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Show, any final comments on this particular topic you wish to give before we move on to the strategic opportunity site?
Thank you. I've got no further comments to add. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much then. I'm just conscious of time, and our session is due to end around about 11. I do want to have a little bit of time to talk about the strategic opportunity site and the delivery of that. In particular, the question that I posed in the MIQs in relation to the shortfall in delivery on the strategic opportunity, and should that be addressed in the plan. So can I just have the council's comments on this, please?
Thanks, Mark. So the strategic opportunity is based on an ambition for an additional level of housing that will contribute towards the local objective of doubling the population. This sits next to, but it's not the same as the housing requirement. It's in addition to the housing requirement. The paragraph 4 of policy 29 is clear that the strategic opportunity for an additional 5,000 homes will only be delivered through the successful implementation of the SUEs, which includes obviously West Corby. But this addition is reliant on the strength of the housing market. And we don't feel like it's necessary to include the strategic opportunity within our plan. It is an additional requirement.
Yes.
So that's how.
Right, that's your position. Yeah, I can understand that. So in terms of the Part 2 plan, as we all recognise that the SUEs, there's been fluctuations in terms of delivery and the success of those. They are moving along, but possibly not at the level that was originally envisaged in the JCS. In terms of the Part 2 plan and what this plan is seeking to do, is there, in your view, a need for anything further within this document?
No, we don't consider it necessary to add anything further. Obviously, if the local housing market improves and in due course, when West Corby does commence, obviously there will be more opportunity for the strategic opportunity to be met. But at this time, I think the plan is sufficient as it stands.
Right, okay, thank you. And I suppose that the comment really from my perspective is that if there are continuing issues here, it may well point towards or trigger the review of the JCS rather than looking at it. That's why I was very keen to point out that we're talking about this document here in terms of the strategic opportunity. It's a strategic level delivery issue, which may be something that is better to look at through the JCS. Can I ask Mr. Lucas, Mr. Silcock, do you wish to come in on this point? About the delivery on the strategic opportunity and its implications? No hands up there.
Sorry, Mum. Yeah, I suppose a couple of quick comments. Just to simply restate what I said previously, really, in the sense that I think the sites aren't coming forward. I mean, it's unlikely we're going to deliver the strategic opportunity, and it's the loss of benefits surrounding that. You know, so I think in the plan, the benefits surrounding it. Sorry, just looking at my notes. What did it set out to be? So we had, so it was about town centre regeneration, job growth, and delivery of infrastructure, necessary infrastructure to deliver against the housing, you know, to deliver the growth ambitions of the town. And I suppose all of those things are being lost. And simply draw a line under it and go, well, we can't deliver it, and that's the end of it. I don't know, this conformity, I never quite understood the concept behind the strategic opportunity, if I'm being honest. I was involved in the core strategy, and I couldn't quite understand how it performed, how it related. You know, we're not monitoring 5-year supply against it, we're not monitoring supply against it. The big SUE which was allocated for it, Corby West, is now bolstering the housing requirement. If we were targeting that, and I think Mr. Smith yesterday in his opening statement, Mr. Ian Smith, did point out they were ambitious judge things and they were looking to target and deliver on all the aspirations of the core strategy. I fear that's not the case. And I think you said, I'm not sure we can rectify that here today and within the Part 2 plan, but I think it does point to a review of that strategy to take account of those lost benefits. And how do we, you know, are they things we should be looking to achieve? And if so, how does that happen? Or if not, how does that work? But I'm not sure we're going to resolve that here today.
I think that's a fair comment. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay then, so I think unless anybody else has got any particular points on this topic, sorry, Mr. Lucas.
Sorry, Mum, I hadn't had my hand up, but if I can just come in, I think the comments you made about Corby at the beginning of this session, the West Corby situation, was instructive, and I think it's interesting that the 271 units is now extremely questionable, which I've always questioned anyway. And the planning performance agreement going forward, I think that's absolutely essential. And obviously we'll have an input into that. We'll have the opportunity to have an input. It was really one of my fundamental issues to actually just to attend, because it's always been a worry from 2016, the way this has gone forward in terms of the 5-year housing land supply. I've always been absolutely, completely skeptical about it. Anyway, so that's taken as read. I understand that, Mom. But one other point, just before we move off or move forward, are we looking at some other of the sites that I've got some questions on?
In this particular session, I'm looking more into the overall approach and the implications of trajectory. I have looked at the SUEs here because those aren't covered in other sessions, and they are because there's no specific policy for the SUEs in the Part 2 plan. They clearly are covered by the JCS, but their delivery is fundamental to housing delivery in Corby through the Part 2 plan. So we are looking at the other sites when we have our next session, which is 11 today, where we're looking at the individual allocations and their delivery.
I hope I'm involved in that one, Mum. I thought I wasn't, but I'd like to be if I could.
Let me just have a look at my list here. I don't think you are, but I don't have a problem if you wish to attend that. If you just have a quick word with the programme officer, because he will need to give you the invitation to attend that session. And I think Mr. Kemp is listening in. If you wish to attend, I have no problem with that.
Sorry, can I just clarify which session that was?
It'll be our next session on the individual site allocation.
On matter 4.
Matter 4, I said I'd like to attend, then I thought I didn't need to, but as we haven't discussed a number of sites, I'd quite like to attend that if I could.
That's absolutely fine. I'll do that now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Kemp. Thank you very much. Yeah, we can resolve that over the next break. That's no problem, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you.
Right, just before we close then, just a very quick word on my very last question, which related to the former Our Lady Pope John School and the council's desire to remove that from the list of allocations. I've seen the council's evidence on this, and I think my concern really here was only to understand how far it had progressed in terms of completion and whether there was some certainty of it coming forward in that way as a committed site rather than an allocation. And I'm satisfied with what I've seen in the council's evidence on that. So from my perspective, I don't need to discuss that any further unless any party on the call here wishes to do that. No, we're all content. Excellent. Well, we're now on 10:59. So unless anybody else has got anything further, any final comments, I will draw this session to a close. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions. It's been a very interesting session. As I said, we're now having adjournment for half an hour or so. We are back at 11:30 and we're going to tackle matter 4, which looks at the individual site allocations. So thank you very much, everybody. I will now adjourn the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mum.